Good evening and welcome to Annenstrasse 53 opening statement. And thanks to all our students and really fascinating audience, because I see now that there are more than 200 people who are joining us at this point. And I see also friends and many artists, scholars and guests coming from all over the globe. And I would like to welcome our guests and speakers today, Ariella, Aïsha, Azoulay, and Bain Modest. So thank you both for coming and being with us at this point and at the opening statement. That is a crucial moment for us, not just an event, but also something that we hope that will be formative for our future work. I have also to say that it was a long time ago, and I think already 5 years, Ariella, since we invited you to be our guest. And finally, we have this pleasure that you join us in conversation with Bain Modest. And we are so honored, Bain, to have you with us. So thank you for coming. Before we start, I would like also to introduce this space where we are gathering now at this moment, and of course virtually. So we are now in Annenstrasse 53, that it is an exhibiting space that aims to mirror, expose, and make public teaching processes at the Institute for Contemporary Art, IZK Institute for Contemporary Art, that is at the Architecture Faculty in Graz and the University of Technology. And these photos from Simon Oberhofer, our colleague, who is a great photographer and architect. So in Annenstrasse 53, we are setting up teaching, research, and as I said, investigation processes, ones that usually take place invisibly within the walls of the university. But the idea is actually by dislocating these processes into an exhibition space through this conscious and continuous flow of teaching and exhibiting, and then slowly adding and subtracting artworks, objects, publication, artistic work, and conversations within the exhibiting space, we aim to establish a certain discourse that is in flux. So we don't have openings and closings, and it is actually connecting topics and positions in relation with teaching and student work, because student work is also part. So we are starting now with the film of Ariella Azoulay and the book. So within this flux, we position research as an investigative, transformative process that we hope will be transformative for all involved. And we aim also to turn teaching into public matter and into something that still is in making and unknown for us. So we also don't know how this will work. And it is intended to become a space in that we will leave behind classical institutional boundaries and actually bring together constitutive and crucial issues in art and architecture, and bring together students, theorists, young and established international artists and architects. So at our institute, our major teaching and research topic already from 2015 concerns and questions normativity in relation to subjugated knowledge, questions values and standards, normative roles, and processes of normalization by understanding that it emerged within colonialism, Euro-American centrism, forced acculturation, fascism, national socialism, and capitalism, together with, actually along with the global war, that it goes, it's unavoidable. So Ariella Aïsha Azoulay argues that the institutions that are constitutive to our culture and civilization, from archives and museums to ideas of sovereignty and human rights, as well as history itself, are all defined by imperialist modes of thinking. So we aim to follow Azoulay by asking what kind of understanding and approach to an archiving practice can challenge and change the ways we engage with our professional habitus, confronting and countering our own political and institutional framework by unlearning. And then through teaching, exhibiting, investigating, naming. So in order to articulate and learn about how to bring into life and establish institutionally the unlearning practice, so based on anti-colonial thought and practice, we start this process by inviting Aïsha Azoulay and being modest today to introduce and discuss her book, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, that we are reading together already for a month as a collective at IZK, and by watching and discussing collectively her recent film, Undocumented, Undoing Imperial Plunder. So now I invite my colleagues to continue, and at this point, Philip Sattler, who is a researcher, architect, and artist, assistant professor at our institute, and a PhD candidate at RCA London, to continue with moderation. And he will also introduce our colleagues. Philip, please.
Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome also from my side. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our guests, as well as the team that has been working on this event. Ariella Aïsha Azoulay is Professor of Modern Culture and Media at the Department of Comparative Literature at Brown University, as well as being a curator and filmmaker. Her work that we will encounter today focuses on the violence of imperial boundary making and suggests a rather under-recognized relationship between documented cultural artifacts and undocumented migrants, which is the foundation of her larger project, Errata, of which tonight's film that we will show forms one part. Her recent books include Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism from 2019, Civil Imagination, The Political Ontology of Photography from 2012, From Palestine to Israel, a photographic record of destruction and state formation, 1947 to 1950, published in 2011, The Civil Contract of Photography, 2008. She is the curator of Errata, which was shown at Fundacja Antonio Tapieś in 2019 and Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin in 2020. Act of State, 1967 to 27, which was shown at Centre Pompidou. Enough, the Natural Violence of the New World Order at F-Stop Festival in Leipzig, and The Natural History of Rape, Pembroke Hall at Brown University. A very warm welcome from my side. Wayne Modest is the head of the Research Center of Material Culture in the Netherlands and Professor of Material Culture and Critical Heritage Studies in the Faculty of Humanities at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. He has held visiting scholar positions at the Yale Center for British Art, Yale University, and the School for Museum Studies, New York, at New York University. Modest's work is driven by concern for more historical contingent ways of understanding the present, especially in relation to material culture and museum collections. His research interests include issues of belonging and displacement, material mobilities, histories of collecting and exhibitionary practices. Also difficult and contested heritage with a special focus on slavery, colonialism and post-colonialism, as well as Caribbean thought. More recently, Modest has been researching and publishing on heritage and citizenship in Europe, with special attention for urban life and on ethnographic museums and questions of redress and repair. He has published Museums and Communities, Curators, Collections, Collaborations, together with Golding at Bloomsbury, and Museums, Heritage and International Development, together with Paul Bessou, as well as a number of rather inspiring articles, like of which We've Always Been Modern, Museums, Collections and Modernity in Museum Anthropology, among many others. A warm welcome as well. The event tonight is organized by a rather dedicated team, whom I would like to introduce also to our audience here. First of all, Roseanne Gush, art historian, theorist, educator, and assistant professor of the IZK. Then Milica Tomic, artist and head of the IZK. Simon Oberhofer, who is an architect, photographer, and assistant professor at our institute, as well as our wonderful study assistants and students of architecture who have been working relentlessly over the last days to realize, on the one hand, the physical exhibition whose photographs you saw before, as well as the online event here. They are Anto Petrosic, Otto Kaltner, and Anna Scheusengeier. Many thanks to them for their work to make this encounter possible. The project started in conversation with Sans Souci Collective, the Institute for Art in Public Space Styria at the Universalmuseum Joanneum, and Steirische Herbst. Thank all of them. And we would also like to thank the State Government of Styria, the Department of Culture, Europe and Sport for financing the event in the framework of Exhibiting Matters Triangulation, the latest installment of the IZK lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. So yeah, thank you, Milica. Thank you, Philip. I would like to express my thanks to Ariella, Aïsha, Azoulay, and Wayne Modest for their being with us this evening. And I would like to welcome all of you who are joining us virtually in Graz. It is, as Milica said, so wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues. And I'm also really happy that this quite urgent conversation can take place in Austria, which is itself a context that is haunted by its own imperialisms and fascisms and denials and amnesias. And I will say a few words about how we see our work as following Azoulay's and Modest's. And so, as Milica has outlined, our project is twofold. We want to work with students to produce knowledge or to pursue transformative, investigative practices which meaningfully address the perpetual crises dominating our world, the COVID pandemic, which has forced us to work in this way online, and the negligent and even eugenicist responses from governments is one symptom or even result of such endemic crises. And to address, so we want to also address our professional habitus, as was mentioned earlier, the university. We are a small art institute within a faculty of architecture at a technical university. And we take seriously then Azoulay's claim that art is imperialism's preferred terrain. This is something that we want to explore further. And I want to pause on what I understand as the inseparability that she describes between the looted and plundered objects that were brought to museums in the West via the means of the ceaseless movement of what she calls the imperial shutter, and the plight of the disenfranchised, the dispossessed, the undocumented, or in Fanonian terms, the wretched of the earth, those whose worlds were and are torn apart by these means. And I'm kind of paraphrasing her work here. So it is this connection of these objects to the violence that has marked their path through the world that we, and I include our students here, are deeply invested in exploring. And we can say that the book and also the film that we will watch later on focuses on this, on the manifestation of these processes, which are indeed mystified and obfuscated and neutralized of their violence by dominant ideology and state apparatuses and modes of, so, and this is what I find so inspiring, and modes of or attempts at unlearning, undoing, attempts to rewind or reverse this violence. And to really think this is very challenging. And so I feel like addressing these questions with students is a kind of privilege, actually. And it's, her work also attempts to recast the world as common, untethered from the capitalist imperialist logic of private property. So in Wayne Modest's work that I have focused on, he diagnoses a contradiction at the heart of our understanding of the Caribbean. He focuses on the articulation or fabrication of the categories of ancient and modern, showing how these have shaped museological practices in the Caribbean and beyond. And Modest follows a line of arguments similar to Azoulay in my understanding, wherein the processes of modernity were and continue to be felt violently and unevenly across geographies. So in the Caribbean, as his work describes, peoples were modernized by enslavement, forced transportation, by the redefining and reduction of gender-based roles, and by processes of racialization, racial and status-based oppression. So thus we find imperialism and its twin colonialism itself inseparable from the machinations of the expansion of the capitalist world system. There's obviously a lot more to say, and I hope that we can address these questions in the discussion later. So then, yeah, I think what we want to do is open the space for a conversation about this, about this really important work, where we can propose or begin to envision processes of unlearning, of restitution and reparation beyond the merely symbolic and beyond the guilt appeasement techniques so prevalent within institutions in Europe today. So this is what we're kind of interested in pursuing. And I'll just say also something about housekeeping, which is, so now we will we'll all watch Ariella Aïsha Atoulay's film, and then we will open this discussion between Wayne and Ariella, and then we will invite also all of you to kind of broaden this in a discussion. So we invite you to pose questions or contributions in the following ways. We are an open meeting, so as you can all see with so many people, it's quite astonishing. So you can write your questions in the chat to everyone, or you can send them to us, and we'll try to, we will read them out. We'll also read them out if you write them in the chat. Or you can also write that you would like to ask a question, and then we can invite you to unmute and to speak. So we have these three different options to broaden this discussion. So now I would like to invite Philip to play the film. Thanks, everyone.
It is no secret. It's never intended for museum display have been looted from all over the world by different imperial powers. It is no secret that many of them have been carefully preserved in pristine museums and are now seen as precious art objects. At the same time, it is no secret that millions of people robbed of tools. Not only do they have rights to these objects, their rights are inscribed in them. Imagine these were the people calling for help. Alternately, imagine that these figures had not been robbed of the people who made them. Imagine that they could fulfill their function and protect those people. Figures required much violence, deception, and manipulation. The techniques of robbing differed, but many of these imperial actors took advantage of a certain kind of kindness, for a lack of a better term, on the part of the natives, as well as their fellows in Europe. Still today, Even though many have some knowledge about the scope of imperial violence, they tend to be shocked whenever they learn about another type of monstrous atrocity. Such types make up the banality of imperialism. And when people argue then and now that they ought not to have happened, they express a naive refusal to accept the normalcy of this banality. Even the objects themselves are not completely settled down. Look at them, and you will see signs of boredom, exhaustion, pain, rage, longing, and disorientation after decades of being kept in places where they do not belong, bereft of the people among whom they used to exist. Artifacts preserved in European museums are not just exemplary masterpieces. They are also congealed forms of imperial violence. Centuries of imperialism have taught armed imperial actors that they have a license to shoot those who reach their borders, carrying only small bundles with them, only enough to provide for their immediate needs. The objects that belong to these people's communities had already entered the borders of imperial states years before, when they were transported by force through imperial expeditions. It is therefore time to refuse the undocumented status imperial states have forced on these people who feel they have no choice but to migrate to the same states and claim their due rights. Their movement is a reparative one, and we are being called to endorse it.
Si les Africains, ils quittent l'Afrique, ils quittent dans des bateaux pour venir ici, c'est dû aux Européens, à la richesse africaine. Ici en Europe, il n'y avait rien. Tout ce qu'on voit ici, il n'y avait rien. On les a pris de l'Afrique. On a pris nos trésors, on a pris nos trucs pour les amener là. Donc, et si quelqu'un qui te prend quelque chose et qui te prend même tes ressources, tu n'as plus de quoi vivre, si tu as faim, tu es obligé d'aller le voir. C'est ça. Moi, si tu me prends tout ce que j'ai, si j'ai faim, je viens te voir, je te dis donne-moi un peu de ce que tu as. Ah, c'est logique.
It's true. They may not have the documents required at the border, but they have well-documented objects in all these museums. This is why they are reaching out. Their movement is a counter-expedition of people refusing to be separated from the world they see as their own. They are expected by these objects. Some of these protective figures still struggle to preserve their protective powers, following them from afar. To see their movement as reparative, we must first recognize the violence of separating objects and people into two separate regimes. A regime in which objects are well documented and cared for by museum experts. Another regime in which people are declared undocumented and subjected to border police protocols. These people are not threatening the sovereign countries in which they seek asylum. They are threatening the prerogative of colonial actors who created a system in which they enjoy similar conditions of movements as do those objects that they looted from others. They made these objects theirs in order to render others objectless and to limit or completely block their movement. Those who reach the border refuse to recognize this dubious ownership of their objects and the rights on which such ownership is predicated. They are key actors in a political reality that they aspire to generate in this transformed potential world of which they are carriers. The borders and legal systems that were conceived to keep people and objects separated will be abolished. From the moment of initial dispossession onward, the people from whom these objects were expropriated have known that the restitution of such objects is long overdue. It is these people's ongoing refusal to recognize imperial ownership of their objects that has made the discussion of restitution possible.
You know what I'm saying here? Because when you look at the picture from this perspective, you see admiration and beauty. When you go closer, you see harm that was done to people. Because now you see cultures closed down. You don't have all the fancy lights around, but you start looking at the details, you see the reality.
The right to live where one's culture is preserved is inalienable. It can be defended on the basis of museums' looted objects.
You cast these heads with their eyes shut, hoping that if you couldn't see their eyes, they wouldn't see you either. Be assured, they have not missed a tiny bit of your cruelty. This is a common imperial stupidity, denying your victims the conditions to respond and acting as if they were in your hands, agreeing to be drained of their worlds. Their resentment is a solid substance that cannot be melted down or prevented from being transmitted. As you dared to measure people's skulls and cast their spirits as exotic items in your imaginary galleries, you also aimed to engineer us, citizens, to forge us as perfect museum goers, oblivious to the blood and toil spent to build your enlightened shrines. You expected us to forever view your plunder through the lens you forced on us, as if we were machines you have the right to program. It's true, it worked for a certain while. We cannot deny that we were taken by the world offered to us by museums. Did we stay here because we accepted the normalization of your violence? No, not at all. Maybe we knew that the intimacy we felt when we entered these spaces could be turned into an antidote for their poisonous origins. As if we were responding to implants, our bodies will resist your violence and your apparatuses, even if it takes time. We are here now to rewind history. Don't you dare believe that we will embrace your model of restitution, which you present as a gift. This is just another form of imperial exchange, where the takers generously give back what never belonged to them. We endorse the restitution of what was naturalized as museums' wealth only in regard to specific objects claimed by communities who were deprived of them. Beyond that, we imagine a more substantial mode of reparations, one that would undo the imperial separation of people and objects. We are here to join others in their just struggle to reverse each and every foundation of the world you built with stolen objects, stolen labor, and stolen lives. We are not asking to be integrated into your world of respectability or to be included among your elite perpetrators. It is not about naming now the people who were forced to represent types. Anyhow, we don't forget the crimes of your collectors, whom you qualify prominent, your museum founders or anthropologists, whose work you praise as groundbreaking. We are not interested in your reparative measures that preserve the same imperial premises. To begin with, we are not interested in being part of your family of man. Presenting the family of man with a new diverse cast of peoples is a colonial gesture of inclusion, one that falls short of repair or reparations. Not willing to undo the imperial system, inheritors of colonial worldviews who still occupy key positions in which they are responsible for representing their ancestors' crimes are today extending their notion of humanity to encompass those whom their ancestors deprived of their worlds. But for those who had different cosmologies, this notion of humanity was always dubious. This notion of the family of man was made possible only because you plundered samples and specimens from every corner of the earth and made them components of your narratives. To expect us to enter into a conversation with you, you first have to disown what you plundered. We have become the constituents of museums and archives, and as their constituents, we demand the disowning of looted objects. Disowning is a first step in the liberation of these objects from the imperial yoke, a move toward making them available to others to whom they belong, either in their own countries or in the countries where the objects were carefully preserved to make sure their claimants wouldn't have access to them. Disowning should be unconditional. The future of these objects must be determined only by their rightful claimants. Why do you think the arm of this figure was cut? to prevent you from appropriating its secrets like you appropriated everything else. Why do you think these people who inherited their ancestors' art-making skills need experts in art to teach them how to make art? They do need reparations for the damage caused to the infrastructures that render art-making possible. You can teach them to sculpt figures with their arms intact, but they will still refrain from divulging their secrets. In the display of each object, we cannot but recognize the brutality of the apparatus of the museum. These objects should have stayed on top of the baskets in which they kept their relatives' bones. By denuding queens and kings of their regalia and showing it in museums, you are able to claim that your democracies are the only legitimate form of power. At first, art experts in Berlin or Paris, in New York or Vienna, denuded these objects of everything that they considered to be superfluous to their pure forms. Today, they are enlivening these objects by placing them next to photos of the people who inherited their meaning, recreating colorful scenes of communal life in the museum. These are not reparative measures, nor are they a form of decolonization. These woods are not resources. They never have been. Shaping them in the form of books does not make your extraction more acceptable. Where are the carved tusks or other objects of which these were parts? Your obsession with serial numbers cannot erase the violence. Fragmenting these objects and selling the parts to different European capitals were helpful measures to solidify a circle of experts that would affirm that your violence was really scholarship. From the enterprise of encyclopedic museums, whose aim is to collect objects from every tiny community in the world, Palestine simply disappeared, as if there were no Palestinian objects, as if Palestine were not part of Asia. No matter how you turn the map, Palestine is not there. On the geographical map, however, the name of Israel replaces Palestine. But museums of primitive arts do not own objects from imperial states like Israel. This is their way of drawing a line between imperial states and communities doomed to vanish. One day, samples from this imperial state and others like it will be collected and displayed in museums of bygone imperial times.
You see it if you want to see it. But the idea was to start the exhibition with a statement, so the statement that the museum distances itself from the colonial past. If you show that kind of statues immediately, obviously, a visitor could interpret it in the reverse way. And that's one of the major challenges, like in the Rotunda as well. I mean, you can put as many texts as you want, but the first impression that visitors will have is visual. So it's almost impossible to introduce visitors to those old colonial statues with the message that we actually want to distance ourselves from them. And that's the reason why it was decided to start with the blow-up of that painting by Shiri Samba, because the message that it conveys is a message that is shared by many, if not the majority of Congolese, that the statue of the leopard man is offensive. The visitor who has seen that blow-up, he then has the choice whether to enter the depot or simply visit the rest of the exhibition. Not enough for justice to be done, it must be seen to be done, so i.e. it's something that you have to do in public. The idea was we want to bury them, but we want to bury them publicly rather than simply putting them in the reserves where no one can see them.
A map is like a census. It is used against people not in their favor. The use of maps by museums is one of the most telling signs that they are institutions of empire. Most citizens of imperial states continue to consume maps as education, not asking why their own countries give them access to other people's treasures, and why people with connections to these treasures are endangered at the US and Europe's borders. These citizens actually reaffirm their historical alliance with empire.
A few European citizens reject the imperial command and dare to assist refugees who smuggle the borders. The penalties imposed by imperial states are designed to make such acts of refusal even less imaginable.
Quand l'Espagne fait les expéditions à Guinée équatoriale, les Allemands, les Français et les Anglais, ils ont visité pendant le 19e siècle. Ce sont des expéditions beaucoup plus tard que la majorité du pays colonial. Ils sont au jeu du Maroc et aussi des Guinéens équatoriales. Et il y a aussi les expéditions à l'Amérique.
For the museum's historiography, it is quite useful that the term expedition is distinguished from war booty or simply plunder. In this way, whatever Spain took from the very first voyage of Columbus and onward is not counted. Not that it matters so much what museums call it, as museums do not hesitate to report the details of their expeditions and even take pride in them. They often display their efforts under the sign of achievements. Sometimes plunder is described as gift. The museum counts on us to acknowledge that it is natural that these objects are here.
Imagine a palace in the desert without a facade. The facade taken from the Masata Palace in today's Jordan stands on its own in Berlin. The museum describes it as the largest example of Islamic art in any museum.
The museum counts it as a success. If you imagine that you are walking in the processional way through Babylon's Ishar Gate without asking why, but why are we being asked to imagine that we are elsewhere? What is this weird idea of imaginary dislocation? Especially strange because it is not in fact imaginary, but a real dislocation brick by brick, a plundered recreation of others' world that might invite us to disavow the real condition of where we are so that we can imagine being elsewhere.
The museum seeks to provide visitors with a comprehensive story about the objects on display, one that provides context and offers the feeling of being part of the research. This story often includes incriminating details about the act of collecting, but these are not presented as such. The museum pretends to ask difficult questions. Nearby, the prayer niche, from Konya, modern-day Turkey, the text reads, "Did historians have the right to remove pieces from their original places?" And a reply follows. In the early 20th century, many pieces were broken off and sold in many places. Berlin experts collected about 65% of the individual pieces and reconstructed the niche in Berlin. In Turkey, people think differently and ask according to what logic a 13th century prayer niche from central Anatolia is being displayed in Berlin. A prayer niche is not just an archaeological object. Turkish authorities even contest the right of a sultan to give such a thing as a gift.
People who work in museums, they have this kind of a fetishism for the collection. I mean, it's almost as if they want to protect the objects from the public, but what's the point?
This wealth of objects was made inaccessible to the people who created them and to the communities in which they had been produced and used for many purposes other than contemplation. The breach between colonized people and their objects and resources, which Euro-American museums hold, is one of the founding principles of imperialism, which has not yet been abolished and is still not conceived as an open debt that Europe owes to colonized peoples.
The collections in public museums such as ours are inalienable, so we're not supposed to actually restitute them. When you're confronted with the fact that 80 to 90% of Africa's cultural heritage is kept outside the continent, how can you not be in favor of restitution? It just doesn't make any sense.
The restitution of objects, the hiring of refugees as guides to work in museums that hold artifacts plundered from their homelands, and the creation of digital archives of destroyed cities could be the beginning of reparations, or they could be nothing more than the continuation of imperial institutions benefiting from other people's cheap labor, resources, and memories.
Do you remember Diyohana in Usman Saben's film Black Girl? When formerly colonized people knock on your doors, they are offering you a gift. the gift of awakening from your colonial crimes? When Dao Hannah was maltreated, she took this gift back. With her, we learn that a gift is irreducible to the object, for it is not unconditionally given. Imperial crimes are materialized in your institutions, professions, and gestures. The gift offered to you is a way out of the position that compels you to act as a guardian of these crimes. When you don't recognize this gift, you see yourself as the one who is required to give. Even worse, you attack when the gift is taken back. Remember that the rights of those people you condemn as undocumented are inscribed in the objects that you hold against them.
Il doit savoir que même le corps que nous habitons, nous sommes en location dedans. Le corps, notre corps, on est en location dedans. Et il n'y a pas de frontière. La terre, il n'y a pas de frontière. Quand tu es dedans, il n'y a pas de frontière. On ne va pas demander, toi tu es français, tu vas rester de l'autre côté de la terre. Toi tu es sénégalais, tu vas rester ici ou non quelque chose. Quand on est mort, on est tous dans le même trou.
Hello, everybody. I hope everybody had a chance to see the movie either through our Zoom broadcast or also via the link that we posted. And I hope connection was stable enough that everybody could enjoy undocumented Unlearning Imperial Plunder. Thank you, Aïsha, for providing the film and sharing it with us tonight. I will just give a brief outline before I will open the stage for Wayne and Ariella. I think as a point of departure of, let's say, the following conversation, the film shows how the imperial shutter, if it were kept open, could actually operate differently and argue against an epistemic and let's say, ontological flattening of history, of the hegemonic view, and question sort of the colonial modes of collecting and exhibiting. And I think Ariella writes here in the introduction to her book, thinking about imperial violence in terms of a camera shutter means grasping its particular brevity and the spectrum of its rapidity. It means understanding how this brief operation can transform an individual rooted in her life world into a refugee, a looted object into a work of art, a whole shared world into a thing of the past, and the past itself into a separate time zone, a tense that lies apart from both present and future. Thus, I think the film operates as a, let's say, a point of departure of, let's say, institutional as well as anti-colonial critique, where I believe Wayne Modest becomes a crucial voice, who in his practice and also writing questions such imperial modes of collecting and colonial representation, but also brings and, let's say, delineates the dichotomies of the imperial shutter, civilized, savage, modernity, nature, and others, and opens, let's say, the more ambiguous positions of those not fitting into this simplistic categorization, let's say those neglected and made invisible. And I believe here he connects with when Aïsha writes, potential history is a form of being with others, both living and dead, across time, against the separation of the past from the present, colonized peoples from their worlds and possessions, and history from politics. What we try tonight is as, let's say, a mode of triangulation, which I think come to think of it, it's in itself maybe an imperial operation of findings one's position and bearing. But we hope that between the book, the film that we showed, and our discussion tonight, we begin to learn how to unlearn, how to think the world differently and bring forth all the many worlds contained within. So we're very much looking forward now to Aïsha's and Wayne's discussion and how they will look beyond, let's say, the imperial framing of the colonizer's image. And always remember the words of the Grand Audre Lorde, however the image enters, its force remains. I would like to give the stage to Wayne and Ariella.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for enabling this conversation to take place.
Yes, and thank you, everybody, but also thank you again, Ariella, for the book, for the film. I'm not even sure how to start this, but I want to start and how we're going to do it. You and I have exchanged, but there are a set of questions that I'd be interested in attending to, and so we could have a conversation about that. But I wanted to start out another way, just because of to acknowledge something that happens to me when I saw the film, and see if we can start there. Because I need to acknowledge for the audience that I am a part of the complicit regime of the imperial formation. I work exactly in one of these ethnographic museums. And I read your book together with students while at UPenn in the beginning of this year. And one of the students, after reading the book, she left really confused, and we were all confused, because her question was, but what are we to do? How do we attend to being implicated in the system that we are trying to critique? What is at stake that we become complicit in that imperial shutter itself that we are supposed to unlearn? And so in watching the film and in reading the book, I want to therefore start out with the impossible question to you, which is how do we inhabit this position in the present? That position that realizes that one is as much a part of the problem as one can imagine to be a part of any solution. That one is complicit in the regime of imperial formation, in the work we do, whether or not in the university or in the museum. How are we to unlearn the technology that we've come to know and inhabit? I want to start out with that as a troubling question, I know, but if we could riff on that a little bit more, and then we can go into my other question, which is much easier.
Okay, I knew it will not be easy. Thank you, Wayne. So first of all, let me say, that you are not the only complicit, right? The fact that you're working in the museum doesn't, make you in a privileged position of complicity. I think that we were born into a world where we are, our complicity is being extracted from us on a daily basis. Right? So museum, is a site where you see it, let's say, in a clearer way. The visibility of complicity is out there. But I think that, when we take the question of unlearning seriously, we should even avoid to say that we want to learn to unlearn. We should just be in the unlearning. And what does it mean to unlearn? So first of all, to acknowledge that we were born into an imperial world. And once you acknowledge that you were born into an imperial world, of course you're part of the problem. So just, unlearn the, the idea that you can be not part of the problem, right? So unlearning is first of all, a series of acknowledgement. And of course, we are not part of the problem in the same way. The toll on us is not the same. There are people who are paying higher prices. There are people who are paying, smaller prices. There are people who allegedly do not pay any price, right? But if we acknowledge that we were born into an imperial world, the question is constantly, how do we unlearn imperialism? And I think that one of the, the most obvious places to start, even though for many people it is not obvious, is to start by unlearning our identities. We were born and we were assigned an identity. And this identity is fatal. It is really fatal. And it takes years to unlearn our identities. And I think that, we can recognize it from other realms, let's say from the realm of gender. We recognize there, that people are being born into the wrong identities, but we do not recognize it when it comes to other type of identities that are related to geographies or to people or to, let's say, racialized people, the way that people were racialized. So I think that to start, to address your question, I think that we have to unlearn our identities. And by unlearning our identities, our assigned identities, I think, we have also to include in it unlearning our professional self. And as you speak about, working in the museum and being complicit with the museum, let's just, make, kind of equation between you and me. I'm working in the university, and the university, is not called a museum, but, the access, the privileged access that I have to everything that was plundered from all over the world is similar to what you have to deal with. So I think that, together with unlearning our identities, our assigned identities, we have to unlearn our professional self. Mm-hmm. And what do I mean by unlearning our professional self? It doesn't mean that you have necessarily to quit your job. It's really creating a failure of, professionalism, a failure. What do I mean by failure? Let's think about these objects that you saw, in my film. We can say, they were just, all of them were transformed into works of art. Some of them were religious, right? This is the easy way to think about it. And then we would think about restitution. So let's restitute at least the religious objects because we have no right to hold them in museums. But this is really the easy way. I think the more complicated, work of unlearning is to unlearn those objects as objects, is to relate to them as amputated parts of worlds. And if we relate to them as amputated parts of, worlds that were destroyed, and we know that people nonetheless, continue to transmit different things out of those destroyed world, we have to relate to them as objects that we in our professional self or in our professional institutions cannot handle them alone without the help of people who continue to carry the knowledge. And what I'm trying to do in the film is to create a kind of proximity between the forced migration of objects and the forced migration of people, because the people who are trying to reach out to the US or to Europe today, these are people that their worlds were ravaged by imperialism, and this is one of the reasons why they are asking asylum in different places. So if we relate to those objects as amputated parts of their world in the museum, in the university, we have to create a failure of expertise. We cannot, continue to handle professionally those objects without the help of those people who are not being allowed to join them. And if the next question will be, do you think it's possible? I have no idea. But I don't think that we have to limit our, our modality of providing potential histories to what our institutions will agree with. Right?
Yes, yeah, but I think that's actually, to be honest with you, working within the institution that I work in anyway, I think that it is possible. So I will start out by saying that thinking of other possibles or other probables is also one of the work that we need to do as institutions, rather than to limit ourselves to the impossibles of the regimes that the institutions bequeath to us in certain sense, or imperialism. I want to put the question of these, what I have called in my own thinking, but drawing from Paul Bossu's work, of these, bringing these two diasporas together. I want to put that aside a little bit to go to a second thing that I think was interesting in the work. When you speak just now about unlearning one's identity, and I want to wonder with you about the relationship between that and the question of disavowal. And how do I, for example, how do we, for example, yeah, and this came up in your book as well, right? Disavow the citizenship regime that say that I am the owner, partly the owner, of the objects in a museum that were stolen. That as a citizen, I own the theft that happened. What is at stake in disavowing, and Ghassan Haj had a nice statement online recently, in disavowing these histories of violation that we come to claim, or we are forced to claim, within the regime of quote unquote national identity ideas? How would you respond to that?
So, I think that, there were so many layers in your question. Let me take them, maybe not one by one, because I'm not sure that I remember all of them, but let me start, with several of them. So first of all, I would like, to single out a question that I would like to address you after I will reply to your question.
Yes.
You said that in the institution where you are working, it is possible. Yeah. So my question would be, I would like to hear more, how is it possible? But I would like also to comment on the fact that you said it is possible. I think that oftentimes when your students that you describe, they feel frustrated. So how are we going to continue? What are we going to do? They forget that there is a history of how to do this. Yeah. So if you say that it is possible, it is because, there are several things that people are doing for 500 years, right? So our students should not ask themselves, wow, how am I going to take it on my shoulders? No, your shoulders are part of 500 years of shoulders, yeah. Right? So the question is always, not as how I or you, we will do it in the future. The question is how we capitalize on what people have already exercised as, reparations, or as repair, or as modality of restitutions, or as modalities of return. So this is the first thing that I would like to relate to. And then the question, the question that you ask about, the unlearning of the identity, and that, as national subjects, as imperial subjects, we were born to those identities, that it comes with the idea that we own what is in our, country or state or land. And unlearning your identity is complexifying the geographies, I think, of one's identity. And complexifying the geographies of one's identities intersects also with complexifying the imperial temporality. And I would like, to give, I cannot reply to you how you should do it, but I can say how I'm trying to do it, even though I am not in the museum, but, in my work, when I wrote this book, I have already, written part of it with the name Aïsha. I was not called Aïsha when I was born, but once I discovered that this name was concealed from me, just embracing the name opened up so many, vista in order to continue the process of unlearning. I was born to believe that I am an Israeli, right? Because this is the identity that was assigned to me at birth. And, this is one of the passports that I have, And the question is how you unlearn substantially this identity. And to unlearn this identity, one of it is because of, the way that it is weaponized against Palestinians who were expelled from the country, and whose property is being considered mine as long as I consider myself an Israeli, as long as I continue to recognize myself in this identity. But another thing that opened up since I called myself with the name of my grandmother that was concealed from me is the understanding that this 48, that for years in my scholarship, I am trying to undo its consequences in order to pose, in order to formulate or configure the unconditional right of Palestinians to return to their land, which is of course related to the unconditional, rights that we can speak about in relation to objects. But after, investing so many years in unlearning 48, all of a sudden I realized when I stopped recognizing myself in this, assigned identity, I realized that actually my entire history was taken from me, and brutally. I always knew that, my family came from Algeria, but to understand, in a meaningful way, that while recognizing myself for years as an Israeli, the fact that the life of Jews in Africa, in different places in Africa, and especially in North Africa, came to an end due to 2 colonial projects, I think that what came out of it is not what is expected, a position of victimhood, but what came out of it is the urgency to complexify the geographies of imperialism. So I think that if all of us, and no matter from where we are coming, we are complexifying our geographies in relation to other people with whom we share the same states, nation states, or the same countries, we understand that there is no way to claim those objects for any national museum. So here comes maybe, and I will end here. So here come, one of the terms that I'm elaborating, in the book and in the film, which is the term disowning. If we, as the constituencies of museum or academia, it doesn't matter, it's part of the same institutions, if we claim the right, our right not to be complicit with what was taken under violence, and we claim that museums, in order to respond to us as, service, givers in their institutions, they must disown those objects. So many, different options how to handle these objects in relation to where they were taken, in relation to local communities all over the world, and also in relation to communities of plunderer or their descendant, who have the right not to continue to be perpetrators and not to continue to hold as, captive or hostages all these objects in the museum. So it's a kind of, spiral answer, but I don't think that there is any direct answer to your question.
No, but that's wonderful, actually. I'm very invested in this idea of the disowning. And to answer your question, one of the very work that we've been trying to do is exactly how you describe the students' work. That at stake in what we are doing right now is not the urgency of any form of innovation, that we're going to innovate something new, but rather that the potentials of thinking, for example, simply about objects not as objects, is already there. It is already in the collections. That is already done in many places across the world where the objects themselves are not necessarily as you describe it here in terms of the limb, but they are, for example, they have a certain kind of personhood that lives within a certain kind of community. And that personhood means that you have to take the object in a totally different way. So we have been asking ourselves these questions in the research center, and I just received this, shamefully, a big research project that is exactly attendant to criticize the use of the word gift. What does it mean when we say the objects were given? To criticize the terms that we use when we say expedition. The project is intended to try and complicate the notion of ownership by asking the question, and I give it as a joke, but it is not a joke. If one were to think the Maroon, Jamaican Maroon understanding of what ownership of property looks like, then that property has nothing to do with personal property. It has to do with a shared common ownership, which means that once the property is used by the person who uses it, then it belongs to them for that moment, and it moves on to the next person when it becomes used. But it is that kind of common ownership. What might it mean to think squatting as a form of ownership that thinks differently about how we recognize it? So this project that we're trying to do is, for me, an example of how I see the potentialities of it working. For example, one of the questions that we're asking in this project is, we critique the universalist claim to the idea of value. It is valuable for science. And what does that mean? It is valuable for science. So we are invested in that kind of project right now. And I would say that even if one were to look at the work that has been happening critically, because I myself, I'm very critical of that work, the work that has been happening within the framework of what has been described as source community work in museums like ours, the failing of, one has to account and acknowledge the failing of those kind of projects where you say, you know, we speak to source communities about objects. But there is some kind of potentialities to those kind of projects as well, which alludes to what you describe when you say one has to unlearn skill, expertise, to be able to say we have to do it together. And we have to do it with knowledges outside of the institution. So for me, actually, the reason why I say it is possible is actually it pushes against what I describe in my own work, which I don't think anybody has seen, has the horizons of impossibility that museums always embed in their conversation about restitution, by saying it will take 20 years to do research, by saying we cannot find out who it belongs to, by giving all sorts of excuses to actually imagine horizons of possibilities, of potentialities that we must inscribe ourselves into. And that, for me, is where I'm writing out something now on the questions of hope, not necessarily as a joyous project, but rather as a kind of imagining the horizons of possibilities. I want to probably move to something else though, because
May I just respond
yes,
to something, Wayne? Because it's really very rich what you described, and I feel like I really want to say a few things about this. I think that, you know, one of the moments when you speak about, you know, your critique of those kind of, you know, community reach out, you know, that is done in museums, of course, because, you know, museums think that if they do this, first of all, they have, you know, they're very satisfied with what they did.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the most important things to, you know, to understanding this kind of, you know, processes of unlearning, that we have no right to be satisfied.
Yeah.
Until the world will be totally decolonized. There is no reason, you know, to be satisfied. And even if Macron will send back 90,000, you know, objects to Africa, there is no reason for to be proud. This, I think, really, I understand that we share the same sentiment, but I think it's really important to understand it in this kind of work, and also to understand that whatever we are doing cannot, you know, give a full answer, right, to this problem. So these are just, you know, attempt or experiment in, and the idea is to experiment in, not when they reach out, you know, to communities, they think that we have the objects. Now it will take, as you said, 20 years to research provenance. Why do we need always the provenance? The provenance is not the only, you know, question. And oftentimes you know the provenance and you do nothing with it. So I think that what, you know, the role that we have, you know, in museums, in academia, everywhere, outside of academia, is to try to come up, you know, with other configurations of knowledge to address those questions. And I'm thinking, you know, when you mentioned the Maroon communities and you mentioned a different, you know, approach to ownership, I'm thinking, you know, about one of the most, you know, well-known cases of restitution claim that really stands for the objects. They ask for the objects, right, in Benin. There are, you know, decades of restitution claims, and of course the provenance is clear. There is no doubt that it was plundered, and nobody, you know, planned to return those objects. And they are spread all over the world between Europe and the US. But I think that what is important also to understand, in order to detach the question only from provenance and only from this, you know, idea of clear, direct geographical restitution, we have also to see how the plunder and imperialism in general, or racial capitalism in general, they destroyed all the other political and social modalities of sharing the world. And what do I mean by that? When you read, for example, you know, the diaries of those who looted Benin, they describe how they were perplexed by not understanding the tenure, the land tenure system in Benin, because there was no ownership. But what does it mean that there was no ownership? The house the family house, but family, not the nuclear family, right? Not the heteropatriarchal family, but the family in large. The house could never be sold because this is the house of the family. And what made it the house of the family is that there were figures, you know, clay figures encrusted in the houses. So what they did, they are coming, they are deracinating, you know, those figures. They are destroying the house, and together with the house, they destroy the entire city, which means that they destroy an entire system of rights. And by destroying this entire system of rights, it impacts, you know, in all directions. First of all, of course, it impacts, you know, the Benin people that, you know, were thrown back to ground zero where they had to reconstruct everything. But also it helped the West that created so many violent institutions like museums, archives, border patrol, etc., to tell us that there is no other way to relate to houses. Yeah. There is no other way to relate to your family property. There is no other way to relate to photography rather than private property. There is no other way to relate to art as an object in the market. So we have to understand also this destruction brought by imperialism, how it worked in both sides. Of course, the Benin people paid the toll, the highest toll, but we have to understand how they created such a flat, unidimensional system, political system, where at the end of, you know, centuries or decades of struggle for decolonization, we end up with 200, you know, nation states in the world, right? All these. So I think that, you know, even in the museum, when we relate to objects, we have to complexify, you know, the different political, social, cosmological, ecological formations that were destroyed in order for us as experts to relate to those objects as if we have to create a world for them. No, we have to bring the world back to reflect some of the other options.
And I really like that, because you are also saying, and I remember this when you were in the Netherlands, and you gave, you know, the beginnings of this book, that destruction is exactly a part of the creation of an imperial right. It is to destroy it so that you say, I claim the right now to say that this is what it is. Now, Ariella, we could talk forever, and I think that shouldn't happen, because others should talk, but because I have 6 other questions that I want to ask you. But one of the things that I would be interested in.
I'll try to be short in my answer.
No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't. One of the things I would be interested in, and our hosts probably could say to us at one point, you know, let us ask another question, Wayne, and you stop. So they could help us. But I'm very intrigued, very excited by your bringing together these two different, one could call them diasporic formations. Paul Basu speaks about that in an interesting article where he proposes the idea of this object and people diaspora. And I think, what's his name, Arjuna Padurai, has a small article, a provocation, where he speaks of, he did this lecture in Berlin where he speaks of what he calls the accidental migrant. And he also provokes us to imagine the relationship between the objects in museums and what was at the time being spoken about as the migrant crisis, right? So how do you bring those together? Now, you sketch out a complex formation for thinking about how we might take that. And I want to ask you just probably to reiterate, but shortly, what is the consequences for us as museums if we were to take that seriously? If we were to take this seriously of bringing those two different groups together? If we were also to take seriously that one of the regimes of the imperial project is to suggest that objects have the right to be here, but people from the countries where objects come from that were colonized need visas to come here, and we decide on the visa regimes that get them into the. So what is the consequences of reorganizing or thinking around that for, say, a museums like, no, I won't call it a name, my museum, for example? What if we were to think it otherwise?
So I don't know, you know, to answer about the consequences. I know to affirm that this is what should be done. Again, the question, if Is it possible? I don't know. But even if it is not possible, I think that we have even to simulate the possibility that it happens, right? So I'm thinking, you know, about this connection. In the film, I emphasize it, you know, between the undocumented and the objects, right? And I think that, you know, there in the museum, we have to identify all the objects that belong to people who are coming from these different places, right, as asylum seekers, and to try to make, you know, their display, try to make research about their possible connection, and try to reach out to those asylum seekers, you know, whether they are now in Greece or in other places, to try to work with them how we transform those objects into their passports. And I think that this is, you know, another way to transgress the limitation that those amputated parts are being, you know, reduced to art objects. But I think that, you know, this connection between the undocumented and the object is, you know, only one of them. Another one is, of course, you know, people are asking to restitute their objects, like the Benin case. Another way to think about it, and I'm thinking, you know, about the US because I'm living here for 7 years, so I understand a little bit more, you know, how it can be reconfigured here. I'm thinking, you know, about this summer, you know, with several, you know, brutal murders by African Americans by the police. Many of the, you know, museum institutions put on their website, you know, kind of solidarity statement with Black Lives Matter. But they didn't make the connection that Black people's objects matter too, right? So I think that this is another way to create this kind of, you know, merging between people and objects. So we are speaking about people that are not asylum seekers, that are not refugees, they are citizens, but nonetheless, they are, you know, their life is endangered. And it is endangered because of this constitutive separation between people and objects. And when you think, you know, about the end of slavery, when slavery was abolished, there was no, you know, any attempt in the way that African art was presented in the US to say those are the objects that belong to the people that we kidnapped from Africa. Right? So these objects were continued to be shown for white, you know, public, and African Americans were continued to be exploited through sharecropping, through the prison industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we have to look for different and creative ways to think about people and objects together. And the museum is not necessarily the ideal site, but if we work in the museum, we have to use the museum in order to further this imagination.
Well, in response to that, one of the things that we've been thinking through for that is to try and think through the lens of care and how do we mobilize Black feminist queer notions of what care might mean to move beyond the preservationist narrative. We preserve objects in perpetuity to try and think through more what it might mean to preserve or to care for people and objects together in an ecology, what it might mean to bring them together differently. So we ask the question of ourselves, what does our conservation department look like differently if its narrative is not the 19th century narrative of preservation, but one that is embedded in radical care, and what that might look like in terms of in relationships to people. I think we should open soon. Philip, please tell me when we are going too far. But before I do that, there are two things I want to get at. One, I want to go to the shutter and the idea of the camera shutter and the notion of potential histories. And for a simple reason that I'm interested in, if I understood it correctly in certain parts, that there's something at the outside of the shutter, which are histories which are potential histories that never came to be in a certain sense. And we've been interested in this as well to try and ask, can the museum be a site for thinking about those histories that never came into being? Histories that were foreclosed by imperial formation. And I wondered if you have any statement on that. And then my last question goes to something which we talked about in your last part of your book, which is about the question of forgiveness. So I wanted to end with the notion of what forgiveness looks like in relationship to questions of restitution and repair, and how might we imagine that. But first, for example, with the question of the potential and potentialities in what the museum can imagine itself as.
Yeah, so thank you, Wayne. So let me start with the shutter itself. And let me start with the shutter itself, not only as, you know, emblem of potential histories, but as a concrete potential history of photography. Yeah. You know, for years, and this is how, you know, photography is still being taught, you know, it is taught around, you know, the 1830s, you know, kind of struggle between male white, you know, scholars, practitioners in Europe. But if we understand, you know, the shutter as constitutive of what came out to be photography, we have to understand that the shutter was there from the very beginning of imperialism. Where was the shutter? The shutter was exactly in what we talked about earlier, with the way that, you know, objects were plundered and went through a shutter to become something else, and the property of other people. And the same way with people. They were kidnapped and they were made slaves, or they were expelled and they were made refugees. They were made other than what they were in a world where objects and people live together under care. And here I'm relating, of course, to, you know, the category that you brought earlier, that I think that we have to think about it together with disowning, because we have to care as a modality of disowning. If the institution will disown at the end of the way, this is a different question. Yeah. Maybe the institution, you know, will collapse for other reasons one day, and the disowning will follow. So we don't have to wait for the disowning in order to care. And now to the question of, you know, the histories that were foreclosed. There are, the question is, and you know, every time when we speak about, you know, these kind of questions, we think about the future. And I think that we have to relate to those histories that were foreclosed, not as histories that we retrieve, but as living substance. This is why I tied, you know, the question of our unlearning our identities to the way that we unlearn scholarship. This is the only way to make, you know, whatever we find that was foreclosed, or whatever we are able to keep the shutter, you know, not to get down and up again, whatever we are able to access, we must render it living substance and not another piece of history. Yeah. So when I'm coming, you know, against, you know, this tradition that speaks about the future scares me. Not because I think that it's, you know, it's going to be worse than today. The future scares me because when we think about the future, we again put ourselves in the position of craftsmen of the world, as if we will come with an idea how to craft the world. So I think it's necessary to return, to reverse. It's necessary to acknowledge that the only way to exit the world in which we live is to join efforts that started in the past. And I think that in this sense, you know, you asked me about forgiveness. So in order to be, you know, very brief now, I would like to say, you know, that when I'm thinking about forgiveness, it is based on the idea of separation between what will forever remain unforgivable, which is, you know, what was done to people or to objects or to worlds, and between the people who did those, you know, things. And why do I separate between them? Because there is one question: do you want to forgive to, you know, to perpetrators? And this is not the question that I am engaged with. I am engaged with the question: in a world when the unforgivable took place, how do we repair the world? So one of the aspects is, of course, you know, provide or think about reparations, enable those who claim reparations to be able to shape the world in a way that they will feel that something of what happened to them can be repaired. But the other way is to understand that return in itself is a modality of reparation. Why return in itself is a modality of reparation? Because we have the right to return to the world before it was destroyed. And before, it's not in time. It's to imagine ourselves there together with others and ask what was it there before. And just give me, you know, let me give one example. I'm going to speak tomorrow at the ACA in the Kunst House in Berlin about a film by Onyeka Igwe. And she has, you know, her film is called So-Called Archive. And she has, you know, she's looking at, you know, imperial archives of cinema. And, you know, you see, you know, through these films, for example, you see the colonials arriving to a village. And they see, you know, 20 children dancing, an amazing dance. What they do, they look at it as dance, they classify it as dance, and they put it, you know, in the history of other dances, rather than looking at this dance and understanding there is a political, you know, formation here, there is an educational formation here, there is a world without school as surveillance machine, right? Something brought these 20, you know, kids together to do this dance. They reduce it to one element. So I think that, you know, this is unforgivable. So the unforgivable is not just genocide, it's not just slavery. The unforgivable is that our world was emptied of other options because we were trained to see dance, only dance in it, and not to understand that this, you know, joy against the moment of colonialism is something that, you know, their ancestor transmitted to them. And this is another option to our, you know, school qua prisons.
All right, Philip, are we talking too much? Because to be honest with you, I have 6 more questions, and it's going.
It's really wonderful to listen to you both. You know, we almost don't want to stop you. You know, that's amazing.
No, please continue as much as you can. You know.
So, I mean, it's so wonderful, especially. Yeah, I've been writing down so much, and I'm mesmerized. But I think it's time that we also invite some questions from the Institute and also from the audience. So Roseanne, I think you have some very pressing questions already prepared.
Maybe this, thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. Maybe this relates to, I mean, of course it will relate to what has been discussed, but I would love if you could talk more about, so in a sense, this kind of refutation of the new in your book. And if you could just say more about, or tell us more about how you, because this repeats often, and if you could, and for me it's like a really revelatory, and if you could say more about your kind of conception or this refutation of the new, which is often in like critical humanities also seen as a kind of there's a utopianism there. So this is this clear?
Yeah, thank you, Roseanne. Of course, it is clear. I will reply, and maybe we will ask later when in the context of the museum, because I will take it not to the context of the museum. So first of all, you know, as a professor in the academia, you are being expected to produce new knowledge. As a professor in the academia, you're expected to teach your students to write groundbreaking work. What does it mean? It means to separate us from each other, right? Not only horizontally, but also vertically, right? Toward our ancestors. So what I'm trying to do is to give words to something that many of us may feel, but we don't have words, so we speak about the new. And what I'm trying to do is to think how the new became a totalitarian, you know, tool to separate us from others and to thoughtlessly look for new things without asking questions. Why do we need something new? What happened? Will reparation look differently tomorrow for a person whose world was destroyed? Do we know better than our ancestors what is the right solution for what was taken from them? No, they knew it very clearly. So we must, when we go to the archive, we must, when we are writing our scholarship, we must, as artists, as curator, etc., acknowledge that there is nothing new about imperialism and the responses to imperialism. So the question is how we make all those, you know, form of refusals, all those forms of care, all those forms of self-reparation. And I'm thinking, you know, about this incredible, you know, campaign that is run for several months by the Abanza, in Marseille, at Quai in Paris, in different places. Mausolo Diabanza, you can follow him on Twitter, you can follow him on Facebook, and he's going, to museums and he's taking the objects. Of course, he cannot really take them. But what I think is really interesting to see, and I remember the first day that I stumbled upon it when it first happened, I think it was in the Louvre, or no, it was in Quai Branly, yeah, all this corridor, and he was there. And he took the object, and he took it. If you, any of you went, to the Quai Branly, or remember the very, very long, ramp that you go toward the exit. And he went, and nobody dared to stop him. And even the guardian at the exit was unable to take from him the objects. And we are so, internalized, the behavior of the police that, as a spectator, I expected, what's going on? How come that he's not being arrested? How come that they are not calling the police? And I found it fascinating. We have to understand that the part of the police is in our heads, right? So we have to understand that we don't have to look for the new. What he was doing was something that his ancestors, without knowing who were his ancestors. I'm sure that my ancestors in Algeria did the same when the French colonized Algeria. He did what you have to do, right? So what you have to do is not only one way. We are not going maybe to go to the museum to take the objects, but we can support him in taking the objects because he already created an incredible moment when he repeated it several times. He brought it to court and he forced France in a certain way not to criminalize what he is doing. So there is an opening here. The question is, how do we continue this opening rather than necessarily thinking that we will come tomorrow with the best idea? So Wayne, maybe you want to say something about the new from the perspective of the museum.
Well, I just to say that Diabanza was also in one of our museums, so that was his second movement. So I just need to acknowledge that, and in our own response or thinking about it, yeah, you could also say, at the end of the day, he brings into question the question of imperial rights. He brings into question the question of ownership. That is what he's bringing into question. But to answer just more specifically, though, actually, it is not, academia is one place, and in the Netherlands, we are overburdened by this idea of innovation. Innovatie, all the time. So we need to innovate every single time, and that's how museums work as well in terms of technological innovation. But for us as well, innovation is so fundamentally bound up to extraction, so fundamentally bound up to taking and to discovery. It is bound up in the imperial language of I discovered and I can take. And therefore for us, we are also cautious of that as a framing, right? And that's why we say, and this is where it becomes very nervous about it, we also suggest that already in the worlds that the collections represent are already knowledge of how to live better in the world and with the world than we can ever imagine. So I've been in a ongoing conversation pushing against the question of the Anthropocene and how it is taken up in certain scholarship, because actually we go back to indigenous thought around questions of planetary futures. And we ask the question, what other planetary futures can we tell if we don't go to the conversation around Anthropocene thinking, but if we just work through indigenous ideas of what it might mean differently to think about the planet in other ways. So in a way, we share a similar drive, because the university and the museum are complexly bound up in this drive for innovation and new discovery and doing it better and doing it new. And therefore the question is, how do you push against that? Because we realize that as well, that there is violence in that framing. I hope that answers you.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just, add one more thing about this, because, we covered academia and university. So just that we will not have, the false idea that it's not in our, in the main dish of our identity. Being born to believe that I'm an Israeli is being born to believe that Palestine no longer exists, right? And this is a kind of an ontological, challenge, because Israel was the new state, right? Israel was the new whatever solution, another solution for the Jewish people. The Jewish people that, was deported or exterminated, they came up with a solution to transfer the Jewish people, as if the Jewish people was one unity, to Palestine, and then to destroy Palestine, the old world, and create the new world, which is Israel. And being born, in a settler colonial state where your identity, your made identity, is supposed to replace your given identity. And my given identity would be a Palestinian Jew, because this is, my family from one side lived for generations in Palestine, not in Israel, and from the other side, an Algerian Jew, because my century lived for at least 2,000 years in Africa. So the question is to reject the new, is to hold to the rights of all the people who lost their world when the new was imposed as a nation state structure that weaponized millions of people to believe that they are the reflection of this identity. But I will end here. Just wanted to bring the nation state into the academic because we are struggling with this, right?
Yeah. And maybe one other term, which I was always, when reading your book, also quite curious, because it doesn't come up, is the notion of capitalism. How do you think capitalism and imperialism together? Especially also when we think about, let's say, large parts of the world of art, but also our everyday life, being so deeply ingrained in these sort of processes of commodification of things, of museums as charity cases for certain rich classes, as the exploitation of also workers in museums, but also the artists understood as workers. So where do you see also, is there a distinction between the operation of capitalism and the operation of imperialism, or are they both part of the same project, which I think is the case? But yeah, how do you distinguish this? Because this notion rarely comes up.
So the notion of capitalism rarely come up because another notion comes up, which is racial capitalism, right? So I'm coming, more from the Cedric Robinson, tradition rather than the tradition that speaks about capitalism. I think that, we have to stop talk about capitalism, not in order necessarily to always come back to Cedric Robinson, but because, the way that capitalism was able to institute itself and to stay a benign category, in our world. Benign in a certain way, I had to learn, as part of my citizenship test here, I had to learn, what is the economic regime of the US, and I had, to say capitalism, right? So this is something that is being normalized. So I think that, and the reason that we call it capitalism is, of course, to make, not only unexpected stories foreclosed, but to make the main dish stories foreclosed, that capitalism is racial capitalism. And of course, you're right, art objects and the possibility to create this kind of fiction called, modern art in order to devalue, all other arts as if they belong to the past. And also, but the relation to the object, we have to understand it. If we think about racial capitalism, we have to understand the plunder of objects alongside draining, craft knowledge from different people. Just think about, the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt. He came with several hundreds of engineers and draftsmen in order to suck the notion of irrigation, in order to suck, all the other engineering, inventions that were in Egypt. So it didn't only, took, objects, or the British later on took much more because they stopped him in the middle. So we have to understand, why I prefer to speak about racial capitalism as a political formation in relation to objects, rather than speak about the objects only as commodities in the capitalist world, because I think that the drama of plunder is not the object. The drama of plunder is the destruction of infrastructure, of other political formations in which making art or making objects was part of. So racial capitalism is entangled with imperialism in a way that I don't have to explain it, while with capitalism you have to explain.
And
but
I think
when maybe, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that that is really lovely. I mean, coming from the Caribbean, and you spoke about my relationship with the Caribbean. For me, it is, and thinking with and through the Caribbean, to work, for example, of Tony Bogues, who is doing some wonderful work now on the relationship between slavery and capitalism, revisiting that. One cannot, for me, speak to capitalism without speaking to racial capitalism. It is the work that I do. It is a way of how we think. But there's something else about that that is important for us. So one of the things that we've been doing in our project called Planetary Histories, or Other Planetary Histories, is to invite visitors to not look only at the aesthetic form that emerges when we invite them to look at objects. So we invite them to look at objects, and we invite them to, in a conversation about art practices, about how we constitute art practices in the West, rather than just talk about what happened in the different places. But we also ask them to think a little bit about the conditions under which those objects were made. So it is an understanding of materiality, not necessarily just from the material itself and what it is, but what are the material conditions through which these objects came into being, which therefore requires them to think about the mine and the extraction that happened, that was a part of producing this work. In doing this, what we've been trying to do is to also destabilize our vision from always trying to separate visitors or the viewer from the catastrophe of the making of things. I'm interested to ask, where is the metal from which it came? How did that happen? What is at stake in that, with that metal in an imperial formation? And in doing that, it is about the question of labor, about the question of race. It is about the question of capital. So that is how we've been thinking through this question. No, it is impossible to disarticulate the question of the museum and the Western museum from the question of capital production and the question of race, for us anyway. Lovely question, thank you.
Thank you. Milica, I think you have a pressing question. You are muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you for this generous conversation, and really exciting, because I have a question that is maybe not so attractive. I'm interested, how do you see within this context of image production, that was actually part of the non-aligned movement? The images, they were actually part of the anti-colonial, let's say, wars, liberation wars at the same time. So these images raised and actually were produced within this context, and that actually they were countering the circulation of the images of the imperial states at the time of the Cold War and the liberation wars. And I have in mind this great photographer that is not so well known. His name is Stevan Labudovic, and he comes actually from former Yugoslavia. And he went to Algeria in support of the Algerian Liberation War. And I say always he opened the school, but he was very much against this. He didn't teach. He was saying, I didn't teach warriors at that time. He just handed the camera. So they started, let's say, producing images together while waging the war. So they had, in one hand, they had the camera, in another hand, they had, you know, a weapon. And he also became a warrior. Yeah, I mentioned him, sorry, I just wanted to share this because I felt somehow I couldn't be silent about this, but yeah, how do you see the production of the non-aligned movement war images?
So when do you want to go first?
No, I think you should go first because I can speak to the non-aligned movement, but not to the images. So you go first on the images, and then I can say a little bit about the non-aligned movement as a whole.
Okay, so I'm not going to speak directly about the specific images that they produced, but I would like to engage with your question. I think it's a very interesting and it's important opportunity to introduce some differences, and some differences in scale, some differences in uses and accumulation. Let's continue with the question of racial capitalism. So there is, on the one hand, the plunder of objects that is visible in the museums, but there is another type of, plunder, which is the plunder through images. And the West, the way that white supremacy reproduces itself, part of it is violence, obviously, but the other part is because of this, huge amount of images that were seized, extracted from people, and created the primitive accumulation of visual wealth in the West. So when individual photographers are trying to do different things, what they are doing is extremely important. But we have also to ask, what does it mean in relation to this accumulation of wealth? So it has two aspects. For me, to be a photographer, or to be at the academia, or to be a warrior against colonialism, or to cook in the kitchen for yourself and for other people, it is part of, being in the world. So one is in the world through the camera, another one is in the world through something else. So of course, people are trying to do it differently at different moments. In the anti-colonial struggle, they had a different use of cameras. And we have to study it for itself, but we have also to understand it in the context of the primitive accumulation, and ask where all these collections ended up at the end. Right? They ended up in all those museums that continue to accumulate. I just published, an article that I was hesitant if to publish it or not, in a book that won, the prize now, edited by Tina Kemp and Marianne Hirsch and Gil Hochberg and Brian Wallace, a vernacular photography or something, that is based on the collection of a Walter collection that, started as something that was very positive. Together with Okwi and Vezo, they went to Africa in order to not only to collect, Euro-American photography. So they started to collect, photography from Africa. It arrived to a point where the collection is being advertised as the biggest collection of images from Africa. What does it mean? It's another drainage of, another resource from Africa. So I was hesitant, to publish or not to publish it. And I wrote about this in addition to other things that I wrote there. But this is why, I think that when you ask these questions, so of course, this photographer could have done, an amazing work. The same way that you're opening this gallery and you're doing an amazing work vis-a-vis the community that you are in. But we have also to look at it all the time also in connection to what does it mean in relation to the world that was not yet decolonized. And I'm saying it not as a reply to say that we shouldn't do what we are doing because we are incapable to change the world. On the contrary, but we have to think about it, from different scales to understand the difference between, producing one type of images and understanding how they play different role in the perpetuation of white supremacy, or in the perpetuation of the plunder of different places. And I think that this also has a history. And I see Chaim Dueluski, as one of, the attendee. And Chaim Dueluski work, I wrote a book about him, Horizontal Photography. He works about, deconstructing the camera. So what he's doing is showing us how different aspects of the camera could lead to different potential histories, right? But nonetheless, we have also the capitalist or racial capitalist improvement of the same apparatus that is an apparatus of extraction. Doesn't mean that through this apparatus of extraction, it cannot be used by movement of decolonization for other purposes. So what I'm trying to do again in the book is trying to look at these, different, aspects together. First of all, not to be satisfied completely by what we are doing, to understand that, wow, there is a long way until the world will be decolonized.
Yeah.
And Wayne, sorry to be so long.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, there are two quick things that I'd say to that. I had a conversation recently with a good friend, and we had a disagreement, and the disagreement was a little bit in relationship to this. What does it mean that the regime of preservation suggests that archives and photography and so must always be available for us? And by that I mean very often for the North Atlantic University that is very wealthy, and we always say, but we need to record it. And there's an availability question. Ghassan Haj was the person who brought this to me, the idea that it must always be available to us. I did a conversation in Berlin recently, and we were talking about decolonization, and a student, wonderful student, and she raised her hand and she says, but if we give them back, I won't have the chance to see it. And there's a contradiction in terms in that, right? The idea of decolonization, but we need to keep it so that it's available for us, right? But there's something else that you bring up, which is interesting for me, because the non-aligned movement has a soft spot in my heart as a Jamaican. And what it might mean to grow up in that period in the Caribbean, to try and think otherwise around the possibility outside of imperialism. And so one of the things, the potentials of this kind of photography that you describe, that I would see anyway, and I don't think that there are many photographs of this kind of thing in Jamaica itself, but it is about the other connections, the other networks that were created, the other potentialities that were created in this moment through different regimes of connectivities. And by that I mean, there is this wonderful Indonesian theater maker, and I was having a conversation with him in Indonesia, in Jakarta, and he reminds me of him spending some time, I think it was in Hungary, during the 1970s or so. And in that one moment, I thought, what might it mean to write a history of the non-aligned movement, or a history of those connectivities that emerged from it, through all of those creative, critical, theater, artistic practices that connected people through very different regimes at the time. Because it struck me that he might have known one of my idols, a dancer from Jamaica, who might have been in the same moment with him. And that just leads me to an earlier moment, the 1920s, with C.L.R. James and other scholars who were fighting for a particular kind of anti-colonial work. But C.L.R. James was in London together with George Padmore. And to imagine those moments of different potential or different possibilities of imagining other ways of being in the world, where those networks of intellectuals were coming together to battle with the question of coloniality. So there is something promising in it. And I know a student in Slovenia who is doing her PhD on issues related to this. If you want, I'll give you her name, Tina.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much thanks.
Yeah, so maybe we have a bit of time for a final question from the audience, which is actually one that came in rather at the beginning by Sabine, who says, thank you for the great film and the generous debate. I think it's a nice to follow. My question is about the very material interests of the museum apparatuses and industries, including the critical people. And how do museums refashion themselves the world over? And what is actually the interest of to keep museums open and to keep their profession alive, and rather not just shut them all down and give up this sort of Western privilege of having the right to look and know the world? And then she follows up with maybe with a suggestion of maybe making this museum actually spaces for refugees to live in rather than this imperial place.
Okay. Probably because this is so museumy, I should start. And before we leave, even if we don't do anything with it, I just want to say that one of these days we should have a conversation about your concept of companion and the companion in the archive. I think it's an amazing idea, and what it might mean to think practices of togetherness which is what I've been thinking through recently, or companionship in the fight that we need to fight. Now, you know, the question that you asked is a question that I've been struggling with for a while now, from another perspective, and this actually has a little bit more, and I don't have to name names, but it has a little bit more from a conversation I was having with Saidia Hartman and Christina Sharp around the institution and the notion of abolition, right? And what is at stake in institutional futures in that sense. And you know, when reading Ariella's book over the semester, that was one of my struggles. You know, what do you do with this kind of institution? How do we think of abolitionism? What is at stake in that? But I want to propose something else. You know, in a way, one of the things that I've been working with is that I'm not so sure I know the answer to what the museum should do. What I do know is that what the museum is doing now is not enough. I'm not so sure that I know how it should necessarily always solve its issues. But I know that to allow it to remain with the violence that it continues to perpetuate is just not enough. So what interests me in thinking through the museum is two things. One is probably not enough, by saying that my own work here is perhaps to try every single day to undo, to try and reverse the violence that the museum continues to perpetuate. So that's one side to it. But the second part of it is to give in to something, is to realize that even while we are not sure of how to, or even while we try to unlearn, that one, and even while we, and I'm going to mobilize something that David Scott used, where he speaks about irreparability. Even that though we imagine certain histories and historical formations as irreparable, that does not relinquish the burden of trying to undo them. That does not suggest to us that we are free now to just live with them in the way. So I take this idea of impossibility or irreparability as actually a burden to an ongoing work, an ongoing undoing, an ongoing unlearning, an ongoing search even for what that might look like as the way forward. And that will include massive, that actually also has a very pragmatic thing to it. The pragmatism is that I've been working in museums for 20 years. I know their slowness like elephants, elegant though they are. And I know that change requires work and labor, and that change is not going to happen if I just say, let's give it up, or let's abolition won't come tomorrow. So what is the work that we need to do in the meantime to be able to adopt the criminality that one needs to adopt to ensure that we disown what has been bequeathed to us as the only ways that museums should do? And what that might mean, to answer your question, is it means that from internal to the museum, I'm interested in critiquing, but I'm also interested in critiquing all of these structures that tell us what museums should look like. So I have a very difficult relationship with the International Council of Museums, with UNESCO, with ICROM, with all of these structures that tell us that this is what heritage looks like. Because fundamentally bound up to those narratives is the narrative for me of coloniality and ongoing coloniality. So that would be my answer to you. And whether or not the museum should be a space for where refugees live, that, you know, that is I've seen museums do that, open themselves for refugees coming in. And I think that it is a wonderful initiative in some instances, but one of the things that I find troublesome sometimes in that is the necessary benevolence of the narrative that is associated with it, and how we ourselves are critical of ourselves as doing good, where for what I call the marketing logic, that even before we do it, the press release is written to say that we are going to do it. And that kind of thing I find is this appeal to pride, that I think there's nothing to be proud of. This is just the work that we need to do. That's my answer.
So I'll add, just very briefly, I'll try to be very brief. And I would like to continue with the term abolition that Wayne already brought to the table, and to say that, there are many ways to understand abolition. And if you follow up, for example, with Woody Wilson Gilmore or with Mariam Kaba, abolition is a work, right? It's not about destroying the museum. It's about doing work with the museum. Opening the museum to refugees, of course, everything that Wayne said about crowd and photo opportunity before this is even done, there were such, attempts. All of them are to be blessed, because anytime when a refugee can sleep in a museum rather than in the street, exposed to police violence is good, but it's never enough. And I think that not only museums, other spaces, as citizens, we have to claim them, as spaces that can consider into their activity how to welcome people who are joining new spaces, right? As asylum seekers, as refugees, etc. So of course, the museum, whenever possible, this is part of what should be done in the museum, in the academia, etc. None of it will be, of course, enough. But when we think about abolition, and when we understand abolition really in the, inspired by the work that Woody Wilson Gilmore is doing, and Mariam Kaba and others with prisons, we have to understand abolition as the abolition of principles, right? Abolition of principles, because what enabled the plunder to perpetuate itself in the museum, in the academia, and in the nation state in general are some principle. The principle of benefit, the principle of imperial rights that cannot be abolished, the principle of private property, right? That photography, for example, is a private property, that the work of arts or the objects that were plundered are not only private property, but they are precious private property. So all these, principles should be abolished. Disowning is just, one way to think how to abolish them. In our work, I would just maybe now to tie together the question of abolition with what, Wayne, you invited me to respond to, and I'll do it very quickly, the notion of the companion. So there is one companion with whom, I'm doing a lot of work in the book, but there are many other, let's say, latent companions, or companions that I'm not saying, explicitly that they are my companions, but there are. One of them is because, I spent several years studying, for example, objects that were looted from Congo. The masks themselves were my companions in order not to become expert. So I studied, all these objects, and I had to unlearn the position of expertise that really waited for me around the corner, right? Because I'm going through all these books, I'm going to all these museums, and I'm becoming in a certain way an expert, right? So I'm in a certain way, know to repeat some of things that I should not have known to repeat. So the question is how you struggle against this seduction and understand what you are doing. So the, glissant, the right for privacy, the right to privacy, the right of privacy is not only for people, it's also for objects. So what I try to do, for example, in the film with the incredible work of Bonabel, who was the cameraman, is to look at these objects in the museum in a way that we are being looked at. So even if you try to look at them, you cannot remove their eyes. Their eyes are piercing you, your presence. So in this way, those objects were my companions. And what does it mean to be my companions? To be my companions and to resist becoming an expert is to never transform what should not be transformed into my objects of study. So I don't study them, I study the conditions under which they were brought to be available to me, accessible to me as a scholar. And when I'm going to the archive with my Palestinian companion, who in 48 refused to be expelled from Palestine, I'm coming to the archive and we cannot enter, because he cannot enter, so I'm not entering either. So when I'm saying that I'm going with my companion to the archive is just to say that we cannot go to the archive. So this is where when I started my strike against the archive for certain things. So I'm never going to the archive for to study what happened to Palestinians. I'm going with Palestinians, and together we ask, what shall we do? We are not being allowed to enter the archive. So maybe I should refuse to be an Israeli. And our companionship has a long way to go in order to complete our unlearning.
Thank you so much. I'm aware of the time, but if you don't mind, we could invite one more question from the audience. And I know that if they're still here, Guy Werte has a question. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, thank you to bringing me in. My question is maybe directly to Ariella, Aïsha. I'm very happy to see you and to listen and to be part of this great moment of sharing here with you all. And I have a very, I might say, basic or bizarre question, which is to understand if you have think about the place of empathy in the process of decolonizing our world, decolonizing all the mindset in which we are permanently trapped while doing what we're doing, actually. I'm a visual artist, and I'm asking the question because I work most of the time from a very intuitive ideas and feelings that I will put in relation with factual element, both from the colonial history, but also from a daily experience, from racism or from precariousness in which we are involved because of borders, because of all the institutional procedure that apply on us once we looked at as a color person or as a migrant or as etc., etc. So I hope it makes sense, my question.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Thank you for the question. So I have, you moved from my screen, sorry. Yeah, okay. So, you know, when I started my work on photography many, many years ago, before I had, you know, a clear understanding of decolonization farther than Palestine, when I just started to think about photography, it was in response to images that I, you know, viewed every day in the newspaper. And one of the, you know, major paradigm in the discourse of photography was empathy. And I felt this is totally wrong. Those people whose life are being ruined, my citizenship is being weaponized to ruin their life, and their images are given to me that I will express empathy to them. This is wrong. It's not because I don't have empathy to people, but this is wrong. This is the wrong way to go, right? There is something else there that I had, you know, urgently to undo. Because this empathy, I'm relating now to something that Wayne said earlier, and I share with him, is this kind of, you know, we are immediately invited under this world to be together with others under the condition of benevolence, that we give something. I mean, there is something that was completely wrong. So what I started to do in relation to photography in order to unlearn the category of empathy that came there, feel empathy. No, it's not about empathy, is to try to think about citizenship and the way that Palestinians mobilized photography as a tool to create a space in which when I am looking at them, they are looking at me back, and we can aspire to have a different citizenship in which I am not allowed to look at them at their pain, in which we undo these positions that they will always appear to my eyes as victims of the regime that I will always have the privilege to criticize. So here, you know, came, you know, my two hats. I have one hat, which is, you know, photography studies or museum studies or archive or whatever, but the other one is political theory. So what I tried to do at that moment is to reconfigure citizenship as something that, first of all, cannot be defined only by the state, because the state makes that I am a citizen with a certain amount of privileges, And those whose photographs are being taken or whose property is being taken are being given to my gaze as a citizen. So I wanted to imagine, together with the photographed persons, a space in which we are co-citizen. And if we are co-citizen, it's not about me giving them empathy. It's about us imagining a way out. So the way out was, on the one hand, to criticize the state apparatus monopoly of citizenship, and on the other hand, imagine a different space where we are becoming co-citizens. So, you know, this articulation took many years. Until today, I'm still asking myself, what am I doing? So answering your question about empathy, my entire theoretical work was in this direction of unlearning empathy. On the other hand, I think together, you know, with terms like Khouria Boutelja, revolutionary love, because I don't think that, you know, our sentiments or our affect are completely outside of what we are doing. But the question is, how do we bring them back as part of a political struggle, rather than reproducing the same situation that my eye will forever recognize Palestinian in the position of refugees, or my eye will forever recognize people of color in the position of being plundered, which add, by the way, two other implications. The other one, or maybe I'll speak just about one, because my skin color, for example, is clearer than the one of my father, it took me years to recognize myself as, you know, for example, teaching for years the Battle of Algiers, recognizing myself in the film, not only on the basis of an intellectual interest, but looking at the moment, at this victorious moment when the French are being kicked out. But actually, this was also the moment when the life of Jews in Africa came to an end. But this is completely erased from this imaginary of the film, but also from my imaginary for years. So empathy, yes, but as part of a political rearticulation of the power relationship, how you give place to this empathy in a way that you are not giving empathy to others who cannot give you empathy under this situation. So how do we make room for space where empathy become possible again? This is, you know, reparations, to make space for empathy, not as a benevolent empathy, but as something that we share together because we are human.
Can I just make one suggestion to Guy? There is a lovely podcast series called Between the Covers. And one of the most recent one is from this poet called Natalie Diaz. And she did a book called Post-Colonial Love Poem. But in the book itself, she discusses the question of the possibility, impossibility of empathy. Now, one of the things she brought into the frame was for us to ask ourselves the question as well. In the world that is characterized right now by so much racialized violence, what might it even mean for us to be empathetic? What might that mean for us to be empathetic and not be political? What can we even hold on our shoulders the burden of what empathy could look like when you look at how much violence is happening around the world? So she brings it into question in a really lovely way, but you should listen. It's a wonderful podcast.
What is the name of the podcast?
The podcast is called Between the Covers. One of the best I know because he reads so well books. But if you were to want to listen, there are 3 that you should listen to. That is one, Natalie Diaz, the one by this wonderful scholar called Yun Sung Kim, and the last one by Jenny Epperbeck. But all 3 are actually about materiality, but also about many of the conversations we've been having today.
Thank you very much. I think it's a good note to end with this suggestion of further reading, further listening, and also continuing our conversation. I would like to invite Milica to close this, this session. Thank you both again for joining us so generously. We've been spectacularly over time, which is wonderful. So thank you again, and also thank you for your time.
Roseanne, would you like also to say something before we close?
Just to really also express my thanks to everyone who's been here, and yeah, and especially to Wayne and Ariella, Aïsha. Thank you so much. It's been such an incredibly rich evening, and we cannot be happy with this.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes,
and,
thank you.
Thank you for creating the opportunity to have this wonderful conversation with you, Wayne.
Yes, same here. We haven't spoken.
To be continued,
really.
yeah.
Definitely to be continued.
So let's continue this conversation. Thank you, everybody. It was such a great audience. So I'm really happy, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, Ariella.
Bye, bye.
All right. Bye, bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, bye.